I call Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the problems we have with discussing this legislation and whether it is appropriate and the particular issues that the previous speaker raised is that the SIS is such an opaque organisation, and whatever we pass here, it's very hard to tell whether they're actually going to abide by it because we haven't really got the means of it being accountable to Parliament the way we have with other government agencies. And often when ministers come into this House, they trumpet the achievements of their organisation and the importance of this legislation to improve the functioning of that organisation. But in the case of the SIS, I've been thinking, I can't think of one achievement that it can claim credit for over many, many years. And preventing thermonuclear war was called out. Well, it is interesting that back in November 2009 there was a request from the Security Intelligence Service to Vice-Chancellors of different universities for those Vice-Chancellors and their minions to alert the SIS as to any illicit science relating to problems of weapons of mass destruction. And that caused a bit of consternation amongst the academic community because A, they weren't aware that there were any people at Massey University who were running around producing weapons of mass destruction, and as the Tertiary Education Union President Dr. Tom Ryan said, they do have something called academic freedom and not having state agencies breathing down their necks. And according to Dr. Ryan, this request would, quote, undermine the legislated autonomy of institutions, including the guarantee of academic freedom, end quote. So that was another problem the SIS had, and if you look at more recent examples, Stephen Wills, who was the head of science technology for the Defence Force, the SIS did a vet on him. He was probably one of the very few people in New Zealand who would have any secrets, government secrets, real government secrets I mean, because we are a pretty open form of society and pretty open government. We're involved in the estimates process at the moment. We're getting all this stuff from each department. We know pretty much what's going on, including in defence itself, but possibly someone at the head of defence science technology might have one or two secrets. So he would be perhaps the one person amongst the thousands they vet each year that perhaps should have a close look at them, you know. And but the SIS fell down on the job, and it proved that Stephen Wills was a bit of a fantasist. He shouldn't have been in the job in the first place, etc., etc. Then we look a bit further back at the who? Devon Biggs, yeah, that's another. Devon Biggs was called out. Now, he was a student, I think, either at Auckland or Victoria University, who way back many years ago, again, was, as far as students and lecturers were concerned at Victoria University, breaching their academic freedom and the right to dissent against the government of the day. He was an SIS agent on the campus, dedicated to watching these great subversive students who were protesting the Vietnam War and apartheid and the like. And there was a huge furore about that, and eventually I think they reached an accommodation with the universities that they wouldn't put SIS agents on the campus. So that wasn't really a feather in the cap of the SIS. Then we have the Ahmed Zawi case. That came to public attention, and the SIS was claiming this as a great victory for I've forgotten whether it was 4 years or 6 years before they had to admit that this chap was a legitimate democratic dissident from Algeria, who's now well settled in New Zealand, and nobody considers him a terrorist or a dangerous person at all. They completely failed in that case and caused great heartache both to Ahmed Zawi, who was for a long time in solitary confinement, then in prison, then out of prison, and then finally he got his family here, and he's now settled in Palmerston North and running a kebab store. Mr. Chairman.
Keith Locke.
So we have that. That was a great failure, but even more of a failure was the fact that even though the SIS had access to all the information on Ahmed Zawi, they didn't see the light for so many years. And the special advocate for Ahmed Zawi, Stuart Grieve, he gave a submission to the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee over the immigration bill, and he looked at some of this material that they held against Ahmed Zawi, and he said, well, for a start, most of the so-called secret material was in the public domain, about 90% of it, so it wasn't really secret material, and it was of such low quality as to be virtually meaningless.
Order.
And
Order.
Yeah.
Could I just ask the member to actually refer to part one?
Yes. This is related to part one.
Well, I'm on my feet.
Yeah, sorry.
While it may have some relevance, you need to relate it back so that we know which part of part one that we can refer to. I'll ask the member to continue and bring in part one. Thank you.
Yes, it is relevant, particularly to the debate started off by David Parker on section clause 5A, where we talk about the particular duties of the Security Intelligence Service, and also in the previous part, the need, still in that clause, on the need for the SIS to operate in accordance with New Zealand laws and all human rights standards. And I'm explaining in this particular case of Ahmed Zawi that his human rights were not properly dealt with by the Security Intelligence Service, and it was a sort of a failure of them to abide by what you would think what was a proper human rights standard and proper scrutiny. So that came into public attention. It turned out to be a failure for the SIS. Then there was there was another big case where the SIS invaded the home of Aziz Chowdhury. There was a big case in 1996 on that. This here again was a legitimate political activist, critical of free trade and investment agreements in the main. And the SIS there got into a lot of trouble because it broke the law by actually invading his home when the SIS at that point didn't have legal powers to break into people's homes. So, and the judge in the end, after a long effort to try and get the material on the case out of the SIS, there was a huge struggle there, eventually ruled against the SIS in effect. On that particular case, I think Mr Chowdhury may have got some compensation out of it as well. My mind is not, I haven't got that detail in my mind. But, and then you can go back to an earlier case with Dr William Ball Such, who was, a leading civil servant in our fine nation, a great writer, historian, everything else, and he was found at a trial to be not guilty of, I think, espionage or something like that in terms of the charge. So they failed in that, and there's all these history of failures, but I can't think of one single success. And perhaps in this debate, one single success can be the Minister perhaps can illustrate a success of the SIS to justify its existence and all the legislation we're trying to put around it. And so, surely overseas, they do. Some of the intelligence agencies there, they do have the odd success and tracking down Osama bin Laden or whatever it might be, but I can't think of one success for our agency, so that begs the question of do we need a security intelligence service, or can the police deal with criminality, including politically motivated criminality, instead of this secret agency that's pretty unaccountable, and we don't even know whether this legislation...
Order again. As a member finished, or No, well, I just bring to your attention, this is not specifically a bill about the Security Intelligence Service. I'm standing. And I did ask if you would relate the examples you were giving back to parts of the bill, because if we look at what the purpose of the bill is, it's not all about the SIS. It actually is about the authority given to it to use modern technology and performance. That's part of it. And I've just asked the member, he's got about 50 seconds remaining, just to tie what you're saying back into the importance of the bill.
I take your point, and we are giving access to this modern, much more intrusive technology, more intrusive on people's privacy. So I think that's an additional reason why we've got to make sure that the Security Intelligence Service does uphold the human rights standards referred to in Part 1. And I, personally, and the Green Party are not confident that the SIS will match up, and I think that's where the record of the SIS has to be taken into account. Do you give more powers, more intrusive powers to an agency that hasn't got a track record of success and is getting more and more money, more and more agents, but still doesn't seem to be achieving anything, and is all geared to catching all of these terrorists, of which we haven't tracked down one in the whole last decade in New Zealand?
Chairman? The Honourable Christopher Finlinson.
I did enjoy that contribution.